Part III. Swann in Love. Section 7. She was not at Prévost's. He must search for her, then, in every restaurant upon the boulevards. To save time, while he went in one direction, he sent in the other his coachman Rémy, Rizzo's Doge Loredan, for whom he presently, after a fruitless search, found himself waiting at the spot where the carriage was to meet him. It did not appear, and Swann tantalized himself with alternate pictures of the approaching moment, as one in which Rémy would say to him, "Sir, the lady is there," or as one in which Rémy would say to him, "Sir, the lady was not in any of the cafés." And so he saw himself faced by the close of his evening, a thing uniform and yet bifurcated by the intervening accident which would either put an end to his agony by discovering Odette, or would oblige him to abandon any hope of finding her that night, to accept the necessity of returning home without having seen her. The coachman returned, but as he drew up opposite him, Swann asked, not, "Did you find the lady?" but "Remind me, to morrow, to order in some more firewood. I am sure we must be running short." Perhaps he had persuaded himself that if Rémy had at last found Odette in some café, where she was waiting for him still, then his night of misery was already obliterated by the realization, begun already in his mind, of a night of joy, and that there was no need for him to hasten towards the attainment of a happiness already captured and held in a safe place, which would not escape his grasp again. But it was also by the force of inertia. There was in his soul that want of adaptability which can be seen in the bodies of certain people who, when the moment comes to avoid a collision, to snatch their clothes out of reach of a flame, or to perform any other such necessary movement, take their time, as the saying is, begin by remaining for a moment in their original position, as though seeking to find in it a starting point, a source of strength and motion. And probably, if the coachman had interrupted him with, "I have found the lady," he would have answered, "Oh yes, of course, that's what I told you to do, I had quite forgotten," and would have continued to discuss his supply of firewood, so as to hide from his servant the emotion that he had felt, and to give himself time to break away from the thraldom of his anxieties and abandon himself to pleasure. The coachman came back, however, with the report that he could not find her anywhere, and added the advice, as an old and privileged servant, "I think, sir, that all we can do now is to go home." But the air of indifference, which Swann could so lightly assume when Rémy uttered his final, unalterable response, fell from him like a cast‐off cloak when he saw Rémy attempt to make him abandon hope and retire from the quest. "Certainly not!" he exclaimed. "We must find the lady. It is most important. She would be extremely put out, it's a business matter, and vexed with me if she didn't see me." "But I do not see how the lady can be vexed, sir," answered Rémy, "since it was she that went away without waiting for you, sir, and said she was going to Prévost's, and then wasn't there." Meanwhile the restaurants were closing, and their lights began to go out. Under the trees of the boulevards there were still a few people strolling to and fro, barely distinguishable in the gathering darkness. Now and then the ghost of a woman glided up to Swann, murmured a few words in his ear, asked him to take her home, and left him shuddering. Anxiously he explored every one of these vaguely seen shapes, as though among the phantoms of the dead, in the realms of darkness, he had been searching for a lost Eurydice. Among all the methods by which love is brought into being, among all the agents which disseminate that blessed bane, there are few so efficacious as the great gust of agitation which now and then sweeps over the human spirit. For then the creature in whose company we are seeking amusement at the moment, her lot is cast, her fate and ours decided, that is the creature whom we shall henceforward love. It is not necessary that she should have pleased us up till then any more or even as much as others. All that is necessary is that our taste for her should become exclusive, and that condition is fulfilled so soon as, in the moment when she has failed to meet us, for the pleasure which we were on the point of enjoying in her charming company is abruptly substituted an anxious, torturing desire, whose object is the creature herself, an irrational, absurd desire, which the laws of civilized society make it impossible to satisfy and difficult to assuage, the insensate, agonizing desire to possess her. Swann made Rémi drive him to such restaurants as were still open. It was the sole hypothesis now of that happiness which he had contemplated so calmly. He no longer concealed his agitation, the price he set upon their meeting, and promised, in case of success, to reward his coachman, as though, by inspiring in him a will to triumph which would reinforce his own, he could bring it to pass, by a miracle, that Odette, assuming that she had long since gone home to bed, might yet be found seated in some restaurant on the boulevards. He pursued the quest as far as the Maison Dorée, burst twice into Tortoni's, and still without catching sight of her, was emerging from the Café Anglais, striding with haggard gaze towards his carriage, which was waiting for him at the corner of the Boulevard de l'Italien, when he collided with a person coming in the opposite direction. It was Odette. She explained later that there had been no room at Prévost's, that she had gone, instead, to sup at the Maison Dorée, and had been sitting there in an alcove where he must have overlooked her, and that she was now looking for her carriage. She had so little expected to see him that she started back in alarm. As for him, he had ransacked the streets of Paris, not that he supposed it possible that he should find her, but because he would have suffered even more cruelly by abandoning the attempt. But now the joy, which his reason had never ceased to assure him was not, that evening at least, to be realized, was suddenly apparent, and more real than ever before, for he himself had contributed nothing to it by anticipating probabilities. It remained integral and external to himself. There was no need for him to draw on his own resources to endow it with truth. 'Twas from itself that there emanated, 'twas itself that projected towards him, that truth whose glorious rays melted and scattered like the cloud of a dream the sense of loneliness which had lowered over him, that truth upon which he had supported, nay founded, albeit unconsciously, his vision of bliss. So will a traveller, who has come down on a day of glorious weather to the Mediterranean shore, and is doubtful whether they still exist, those lands which he has left, let his eyes be dazzled, rather than cast a backward glance, by the radiance streaming towards him from the luminous and unfading azure at his feet. He climbed after her into the carriage which she had kept waiting, and ordered his own to follow. She had in her hand a bunch of catalias, and Swann could see beneath the film of lace that covered her head more of the same flowers fastened to a swansdown plume. She was wearing under her cloak a flowing gown of black velvet, caught up on one side so as to reveal a large triangular patch of her white silk skirt, with an insertion, also of white silk, in the cleft of her low-necked bodice, in which were fastened a few more catalias. She had scarcely recovered from the shock which the sight of Swann had given her, when some obstacle made the horse start to one side. They were thrown forward from their seats. She uttered a cry and fell back quivering and breathless. "It's all right," he assured her. "Don't be frightened." And he slipped his arm round her shoulder, supporting her body against his own, then went on, "Whatever you do, don't utter a word. Just make a sign, yes or no, or you'll be out of breath again. You won't mind if I put the flowers straight on your bodice; the jolt has loosened them. I'm afraid of their dropping out. I'm just going to fasten them a little more securely." She was not used to being treated with so much formality by men, and smiled as she answered, "No, not at all. I don't mind in the least." But he, chilled a little by her answer, perhaps also to bear out the pretence that he had been sincere in adopting the stratagem, or even because he was already beginning to believe that he had been, exclaimed, "No, no, you mustn't speak. You will be out of breath again. You can easily answer in signs. I shall understand. Really and truly now, you don't mind my doing this? Look, there is a little, I think it must be pollen, spilt over your dress. May I brush it off with my hand? That's not too hard. I'm not hurting you, am I? I'm tickling you perhaps a little, but I don't want to touch the velvet in case I rub it the wrong way. But don't you see, I really had to fasten the flowers. They would have fallen out if I hadn't. Like that now, if I just push them a little farther down. Seriously, I'm not annoying you, am I? And if I just sniff them to see whether they've really lost all their scent? I don't believe I've ever smelt any before. May I? Tell the truth now." Still smiling, she shrugged her shoulders ever so slightly, as who should say, "You're quite mad. You know very well that I like it." He slipped his other hand upwards along Odette's cheek. She fixed her eyes on him with that languishing and solemn air which marks the women of the old Florentines' paintings, in whose faces he had found the type of hers, swimming at the brink of her fringed lids, her brilliant eyes, large and finely drawn as theirs, seemed on the verge of breaking from her face and rolling down her cheeks like two great tears. She bent her neck as all their necks may be seen to bend, in the pagan scenes as well as in the scriptural. And although her attitude was doubtless habitual and instinctive, one which she knew to be appropriate to such moments and was careful not to forget to assume, she seemed to need all her strength to hold her face back, as though some invisible force were drawing it down towards Swann's. In Swann it was, who, before she allowed her face, as though despite her efforts to fall upon his lips, held it back for a moment longer, at a little distance between his hands. He had intended to leave time for her mind to overtake her body's movements, to recognize the dream which she had so long cherished, and to assist at its realization, like a mother invited as a spectator when a prize is given to the child whom she has reared and loves. Perhaps, moreover, Swann himself was fixing upon these features of an Odette, not yet possessed, not even kissed by him, on whom he was looking now for the last time, that comprehensive gaze with which, on the day of his departure, a traveller strives to bear away with him in memory the view of a country to which he may never return. But he was so shy in approaching her that after this evening which had begun by his arranging her catalias and had ended in her complete surrender, whether from fear of chilling her, or from reluctance to appear, even retrospectively, to have lied, or perhaps because he lacked the audacity to formulate a more urgent requirement than this, which could always be repeated, since it had not annoyed her on the first occasion, he resorted to the same pretext on the following days. If she had any catalias pinned to her bodice, he would say, "It is most unfortunate. The catalias don't need tucking in this evening. They've not been disturbed as they were the other night. I think, though, that this one isn't quite straight. May I see if they have more scent than the others?" Or else, if she had none, "Oh, no catalias this evening. Then there's nothing for me to arrange." So that for some time there was no change from the procedure which he had followed on that first evening, when he had started by touching her throat, with his fingers first and then with his lips, but their caresses began invariably with this modest exploration. And long afterwards, when the arrangement, or rather the ritual pretense of an arrangement, of her catalias had quite fallen into desuetude, the metaphor "do a catalia" transmuted into a simple verb which they would employ without a thought of its original meaning when they wished to refer to the act of physical possession, in which, paradoxically, the possessor possesses nothing, survived to commemorate in their vocabulary the long-forgotten custom from which it sprang. And yet possibly this particular manner of saying "to make love" had not the precise significance of its synonyms. However disillusioned we may be about women, however we may regard the possession of even the most divergent types as an invariable and monotonous experience, every detail of which is known and can be described in advance, it still becomes a fresh and stimulating pleasure if the women concerned be, or be thought to be, so difficult as to oblige us to base our attack upon some unrehearsed incident in our relations with them, as was originally for Swann the arrangement of the catalias. He trembled as he hoped that evening, but Odette, he told himself, if she were deceived by his stratagem, could not guess his intention, that it was the possession of this woman that would emerge for him from their large and richly colored petals, and the pleasure which he already felt, and which Odette tolerated, he thought perhaps only because she was not yet aware of it herself, seemed to him for that reason, as it might have seemed to the first man when he enjoyed it amid the flowers of the earthly paradise, a pleasure which had never before existed, which he was striving now to create, a pleasure, and the special name which he was to give to it preserved its identity, entirely individual and new. The ice once broken, every evening when he had taken her home, he must follow her into the house, and often she would come out again in her dressing gown and escort him to his carriage, and would kiss him before the eyes of his coachman, saying, "What on earth does it matter what people see?" And on evenings when he did not go to the Verderons, which happened occasionally now that he had opportunities of meeting Odette elsewhere, when, more and more rarely, he went into society, she would beg him to come to her on his way home, however late he might be. The season was spring, the nights clear and frosty. He would come away from an evening party, jump into his victoria, spread a rug over his knees, tell the friends who were leaving at the same time, and who insisted on his going home with them, that he could not, that he was not going in their direction. Then the coachman would start off at a fast trot without further orders, knowing quite well where he had to go. His friends would be left marveling, and, as a matter of fact, Swann was no longer the same man. No one ever received a letter from him now demanding an introduction to a woman. He had ceased to pay any attention to women, and kept away from the places in which they were ordinarily to be met. In a restaurant, or in the country, his manner was deliberately and directly the opposite of that by which, only a few days earlier, his friends would have recognized him, that manner which had seemed permanently and unalterably his own. To such an extent does passion manifest itself in us as a temporary and distinct character, which not only takes the place of our normal character, but actually obliterates the signs by which that character has hitherto been discernible. On the other hand, there was one thing that was now invariable, namely, that wherever Swann might be spending the evening, he never failed to go on afterwards to Odette. The interval of space separating her from him was one which he must as inevitably traverse as he must descend, by an irresistible gravitation, the steep slope of life itself. To be frank, as often as not, when he had stayed late at a party, he would have preferred to return home at once without going so far out of his way, and to postpone their meeting until the morrow. But the very fact of his putting himself to such inconvenience at an abnormal hour in order to visit her, while he guessed that his friends as he left them were saying to one another, "He is tied hand and foot. There must certainly be a woman somewhere who insists on his going to her at all hours," made him feel that he was leading the life of the class of men whose existence is colored by a love affair, and in whom the perpetual sacrifice which they are making of their comfort and of their practical interests has engendered a spiritual charm. Then, though he may not consciously have taken this into consideration, the certainty that she was waiting for him, that she was not anywhere or with any one else, that he would see her before he went home, drew the sting from that anguish, forgotten, it is true, but latent and ever ready to be reawakened, which he had felt on the evening when Odette had left the Verderons before his arrival, an anguish the actual cessation of which was so agreeable that it might even be called a state of happiness. Perhaps it was to that hour of anguish that there must be attributed the importance which Odette had since assumed in his life. End of Part 3, Section 7.